Talk about late to the party, it's NES Works episode 124.
Excuse me. Have you ever danced with the devil in the pale moonlight?
I guess it never occurred to me until just recently, but the NES has an interesting thread of formative role-playing experiences running through it. We've recently seen Ultima and Dragon Quest is on its way soon, followed not too long after that by Wizardry. And here in between all of them, we have Hydlide. And of all of these works, Hydlide indisputably fares the worst. It is the year 1989, and this game does not begin to stack up to the contemporaries in the competition at all. By the standards of 1989, Hydlide barely registers as a complete game experience. It's confusing, unfriendly, limited, and repetitive. This is a game that you can finish in the space of 20 minutes. Or at least you could, if you knew where to go, what to do, and didn't have to grind. But that's the thing. Hydlide goes out of its way to be opaque, confusing, and unfair. Developer T&E Soft created this game by the standards of 1984, not 1989. And that means it's ultimately a pretty tiny game loaded with padding. Obscure objectives, difficult tasks, and game design wildly tilted against the player all add up to a tiny experience that takes hours or even weeks to complete, if at all, an account of being deeply, well, a very 1984 RPG. Hydlide presents you with a simple task. You, the noble warrior Jim, must rescue the missing princess. Well, it's not so much that the princess is missing as it is that she's been ensorcelled. Specifically, she's been transformed into 3 fairies. It therefore falls to Jim to find these 3 fairies and not a guy, and figure out how to fuse them back together into a single human princess. To do so, you need to explore the full boundaries of the kingdom of Fairyland, which appears here as a fully open world that you can tackle as you like. Granted, this sounds more impressive in concept than in execution. Fairyland consists of a total of 25 screens, arranged in a 5x5 grid. Because it's a magical world or something, this grid doesn't have any actual boundaries. It loops on all axes once you travel 5 screens in any given direction, which makes it seem relatively larger than it actually is. But don't be fooled, it's 25 screens, plus a handful of underground spaces. That's about 1/8 the size of The Legend of Zelda, a game that absolutely begs comparison with Hydlide. Hydlide has an incredibly simple play loop. You need to find the fairies, then defeat the final boss. And the process of locating the fairies doesn't really take that long. Heck, the first of the fairies is located just a screen or 2 away from the starting point. And all you need to do to reach the others is acquire a few tools that allow you to travel to the sections of Fairyland that you can't reach initially. This involves simple de facto quest chains, like acquiring a lamp, which you do by defeating a vampire, whom you can only destroy once you acquire the cross, which you can do by walking a short distance from the beginning of the game. Hydlide contains about 15 minutes of primary quest, 3 hours of grinding, and an incalculable amount of trial, error, and random searching. The further you venture into the game, the more esoteric the tasks and the logic. Like, why does a pot open a hole in the ground? How are you supposed to intuit that a seemingly invincible foe can only be destroyed with a very specific simultaneous attack? How are you supposed to navigate narrow sea passages when you inevitably get pinned in by sea serpents that attack from both directions? Hydlide is not a friendly game. For starters, it features a deeply rudimentary form of role-playing combat. It's a step above what you would have found in Rogue, in which the player avatar presses up against a monster and whichever has the greater strength and defense survives, but only a step. Hydlide employs this same simple calculation as well, but with the added wrinkle that you hold the A button to attack, lowering your defense. If you press up against an enemy without the A button engaged, you'll confront them in defense mode, which means that you'll deal little damage, but suffer little damage in return. So you can deal heavy damage and risk taking heavy damage in return, or you can walk around defensively and likely survive, but you'll never advance, because you need to kill monsters in order to gain experience, which boosts your life, strength, and magic power, but actively attacking monsters exposes you to enormous risk. Many enemies in the game can kill you in a single hit, even if you're at a high experience level, which makes the process of leveling up seemingly impossible. When you do die, you return to the start of the game, with all of your stats wiped to 0. This game only begins to feel manageable once you start to decrypt its design and features. For one thing, enemies only attack from a single direction, the direction they happen to be facing at the moment. This isn't really evident with the basic slime enemies at the start, which are indeterminate blobs that don't really have faces to speak of. But it becomes more obvious once you begin facing off against knights, who stomp around mazes while leading with their shields. Hit a knight face on, and you'll probably die, or at least suffer terrible damage. Hit a knight from the side, or from behind, where they're largely undefended, and you'll safely inflict a decent bit of damage on them. This turns out to be the case for just about every monster in the game, but it still takes just one unlucky encounter to severely wound a Jim, and there are no cure spells, and only a single curative item to be found in Fairyland. But that turns out to be okay, because when Jim stands still above ground, his health slowly regenerates. Well, sometimes. Different types of terrain affect Jim differently, and some spaces actually sap his health over time until he can level up a bit. As you play, though, you will learn the rhythms of Hydlide. Strike when you can, in the cowardly, backstabbing fashion, then duck back to safety, and find a safe space to heal up. At any time, you can open a menu to receive a password that allows you to resume or restore your progress. Not only that, but the NES cart has a soft save feature. Although it doesn't contain a battery backup, another Strike vs. Zelda, it does have a temporary save. When you select Save, the game stores your current state of existence in RAM. So, when you die, you can choose Load and immediately restore that exact game state. Perhaps the first NES game to enable proper save scumming. And honestly, there's no other reasonable way to play besides save scumming. Death comes for you so quickly, frequently, and unfairly in Hydlide that approaching the game any other way doesn't make sense. Like, why would you do that to yourself? No, save constantly, die, reload, restore your progress, especially when you're trying to level up. See, monsters give you a certain amount of experience when you kill them, to a point. After you advance to a certain skill level, though, they stop dispensing experience. So in order to build up strength and health, you need to take on more powerful enemies rather than just grinding weaklings for piddling experience. And that means you're inevitably going to slip up and die while grinding. So why not save scum? The game is built around it. Even the primary quest chain tasks seem geared around save scumming. A great many tasks can go horribly awry without warning, or else force you to juggle severe randomization. For example, you'll find the first 2 fairies and trees on specific screens. But which tree is randomized with every playthrough, and searching the wrong tree is almost 100% guaranteed to kill you instantly. You'll find the first fairy in a tree near the adventure's outset, but the other trees on that screen all contain wasps that will appear and swarm fatally if you touch their tree. So you really want to save before you make the attempt. And the second fairy, well, she has also been trapped in a random tree in a different arbor. This tree does not pose any hornet infestation danger, but that is because the trees in this situation are perambulatory and probably ate the hornets. Certainly the trees will kill Jim upon contact, meaning that searching the proper fairy-containing tree without dying is a 1 in 6 chance, about the same as losing at Russian roulette. And that's the thing. Like Russian roulette, Hydlide boils down to dumb luck and pure chance. Are you fortunate enough to select the first fairy's tree without summoning wasps? Yes? Well, are you lucky enough to follow that up by happening into the second fairy without being stomped by an Ent who's become violent in his lonely, horny, Ent-wife-free existence? Chances are that you are not, and that is why Hydlide was born to be safe scum. And even then, I tapped out of the quest for the third fairy. Although I know her location and the secret of freeing her, you have to defeat 2 wizards in a single shot of a specific magic spell, the actual process amounts to an exercise in pure chance. The only spell capable of defeating wizards fires horizontally across the screen, but the wizards appear in a space that is a couple of tiles wide. So you need to wait around and soak up damage from the wizard's spell until they both happen to line up in the same horizontal space as you, at which point you need to launch a spell, which means lowering your defenses momentarily, while praying that they don't attack you, which would of course instantly kill you, before your spell blasts them. It's not fun, it's not manageable, and I can't even imagine someone lucking into this solution on their own, happening to perform a random, untelegraphed, and profoundly difficult feat entirely by luck? Absolutely not. And I haven't even mentioned the music. Every moment of gameplay is accompanied by a brief 2-bar loop that tries to come as close to John Williams' theme to Raiders of the Lost Ark as possible without being legally actionable, and then it repeats forever. It's tolerable for a few moments, but after a few hours, it's hellish. Yet it does perfectly capture the tired, repetitive, exhausting design of Hydlide, an unmitigated disaster of an NES game to be sure, and a game that no one would deliberately choose over competing action RPGs like the Zeldas, Rygar, Legacy the Wizard, and so on. And if that were all that Hydlide had to offer, well, this would easily go down as one of the most pathetic releases ever to appear on NES. Now, I'm not going to suggest anything ridiculous like Hydlide is not actually pathetic, because it is. But there's much more to it than simply a terrible release for spring 1989. While I do think launching Hydlide in the US in 1989 was a ridiculous, doomed idea, I'm ultimately glad that it showed up. Because whatever you may think about Hydlide, and you're probably not wrong, this is a work of historic importance and influence, and we're fortunate to have such ready access to it. Hydlide originally debuted in 1984, and in 1984 it was nothing short of astonishing. In 1984, Japan's game developers collectively confronted the role-playing genre that previously had only really been available through games imported from the West for Western computers, and they said, let's do this for ourselves. Hydlide was one of the 3 major Japanese computer releases that year, which helped establish a distinct Japan-focused version of what it meant to be a role-playing game. Appearing alongside Falcom's Dragon Slayer and Bulletproof's The Black Onyx, Hydlide reinvented the genre. Specifically, Hydlide represented the midpoint between those 2 other games. The Black Onyx was very much a straightforward take on the wizardry dungeon crawler format that stood apart by virtue of containing Japanese text. Dragon Slayer, on the other hand, kind of resembled a graphical take on Rogue, with its bump combat and segmented dungeons. And finally, Hydlide tackled 100% traditional role-playing concepts, but did so in an incredibly streamlined fashion. Hydlide did away with menus, turn-based battles, and the need to fuss with gear and stats. It simplified stat growth into a series of a few graphical meters and reduced combat to a fairly straightforward calculation between participants while introducing the concept of attack direction and character facings. Hydlide, quite simply, might be the single most influential action RPG of all time. I know I keep referring to the Tower of Druaga on my channel, but to be totally honest, there would be no Druaga without Hydlide. I mean, just look at all of the elements that Hydlide introduced. Again, it pretty much invented the action RPG. The bump combat, where you need to hit enemies precisely and actively brandish your blade in order to switch from defense to attack, that would show up again, almost verbatim in some senses, in Druaga and the Ys series. The Ys series, of course, also borrowed the auto-regenerating health on the overworld. And Druaga owes Hydlide so much more. From the enemy types, the focus on deeply obscure secrets and tricks, Druaga is pretty much the more streamlined, arcade-friendly version of Hydlide, which itself amounted to a more streamlined and arcade-like take on Ultima. The way your character stops gaining experience from enemies after hitting a certain skill level? We've already seen that in Castlevania II Simon's Quest, which debuted in Japan 3 years after Hydlide. The way the character facings affect defense and vulnerability? That's absolutely key to tactical RPGs like Final Fantasy Tactics. Oh, and did I mention that the overworld becomes populated with more powerful monsters once you reach a certain skill level? We'd see that again in games like Final Fantasy VIII and Saga Scarlet Grace, where enemies scale alongside the player's team, as well as in more interesting variants, like the Souls series World Tendency. And most of all, this game pretty much sketched out the design doc for The Legend of Zelda, I mean, God, just look at it. The enemies map almost directly onto Zelda monsters. Yes, these are more or less standard RPG fantasy archetypes, but look at the knights you can only defeat from behind, and the wizards who cast spells and can be defeated with wave magic, and the monsters in the desert that disappear into the sand before re-emerging, and the interlinked overworld and underground spaces, and the presence of hidden entrances and objects on the map, and, well, you get the idea. Basically, what I'm saying here is that most of the traits we associate with the JRPG and the action RPG got their start here in Hydlide. Or rather, not here on NES Hydlide in 1989, but on Sharp X1 or PC 8801 in 1984. This is a canonical, formative, foundational work. Honestly and truly one of the most important video games ever made. And we totally missed it in its prime. By 1989, dozens of games had looked to Hydlide, borrowed the best ideas, and radically improved on them. And many of those games had already made their way to NES. With so many better choices on the market, Hydlide was a tough game to love as a 1989 release. And yet, I'm glad we got it, even if it made those of us who played it at the time utterly miserable. It made for an absolutely terrible pickup in 1989. But in retrospect, it's great to have such a landmark title on NES to help mark the evolution of the medium. Sorry, kids who wasted 3 months' allowance on this thing back in the day. Sometimes loving history means hating the current moment. Not surprisingly, given its fundamentally ill-suited nature for the gaming world of 1989, Hydlide did not see a lot of coverage in Nintendo Power. In fact, it only received a Pack-Watch segment, which seems like it really underserves a game of such historical significance. Then again, it did share a page with the magazine's sole feature coverage for Adventures of Lolo, so maybe Nintendo Power just didn't have a clear sense of what would end up being deemed historically significant. But hey, we're only human. We live in the present and can only guess at the future. I guess that's what Taboo is for. Next time on NES Works, ain't no party like a monster party.